In 1952, the atomic bomb became obsolete. That was the year that the United States tested for the first time successfully a hydrogen bomb, which is 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. The Soviet Union tested successfully their first hydrogen bomb the following year. This brings a lot more destructive power, obviously, and that was enhanced by the fact that by the end of the decade, by the end of the 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed ICBMs, Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. So, whereas in 1945, a U.S. Army airplane had to fly above those Japanese cities and drop a bomb, by 1960, either the U.S. or the Soviet Union could launch missiles from their own country and go all the way around the world in a short time and deliver payloads, each one of which would be 1,000 times more powerful than those atomic bombs were. The Secretary of State under Eisenhower was a guy named John Foster Dulles, and he has been called the father of brinksmanship. Brinksmanship is where you have two opposing sides that each push each other right up to the very brink, almost all the way to war, and then rein in just in time to keep it from actually becoming full-fledged war. He also invented the term massive retaliation, or mutually assured destruction, MAD. That's the idea that the best protection against the world being destroyed by nuclear bombs is for the two most powerful sides to both have a whole lot of nuclear bombs. The more nuclear bombs you get, the safer the world is, because then both sides will know that if either of them starts a nuclear war, there will be no winning it. There will be no winners. If you start a nuclear war, everybody dies. Therefore, no one wants to start a nuclear war, which sounds good in theory, unless, of course, there were computer errors or operators' errors, or, someone got a hold of one of these things that just didn't care. All of which at various times almost happened. The United States got a new leader in 1953, and so did the Soviet Union, because Joseph Stalin finally passed away, and the person that ultimately wound up in his spot was Nikita Khrushchev, who would be in charge for the next 10, 11 years until 1964. He had a different approach than Stalin. Stalin's approach was, pretty terrible, right? He was a dictator, and he was genocidal against practically his own people. Very, very harsh and repressive, and also very fond of himself. Stalin put up statues of himself all over the place, named a bunch of cities after himself. It was a cult of personality. And Khrushchev decided to de-Stalinize. And to his credit, he didn't replace that by Khrushchevizing. So he renamed those cities that Stalin had named after himself. He improved prison conditions, ended the use of forced labor camps. A lot of people were sent to do forced labor in Siberia. They didn't stop sending people to Siberia, but they stopped having them in essentially concentration camps when they got there, but just rather prisons. He also initiated the Soviet space program that resulted in 1957, as we talked about before when we were discussing beatniks, the launching of the satellite Sputnik, first successful orbiting satellite, which put the Soviet Union way ahead of the U.S. in that regard, and was kind of a wake-up call to the United States. Now, what are relations going to be like between these two new rulers, Eisenhower and Khrushchev? Well, Eisenhower was pretty optimistic going into this because he believed accurately that Khrushchev was a lot more reasonable than Stalin was, and that's because the only person less reasonable than Stalin in living memory had been Hitler. So that's really not a whole lot of a recommendation. It almost looked like there might be starting to be a very slight thaw in the Cold War for a little while. But by the mid 1950s, that had changed, and by 1956, it had changed in a very big way. 1956 saw in the fall of that year the Hungarian Revolution. Now, remember, Hungary is one of those Soviet satellite countries, one of those countries liberated by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, in which communist governments were set up and who joined in the Warsaw Pact. There was a massive demonstration started by college students on October 23rd, 1956, that very quickly turned into a movement with citizens organizing militias opposing the communist government. There's a toppled statue of Stalin there. Time called the Hungarian Freedom Fighters their collective Man of the Year. This was a long time before they started calling it Person of the Year. And at first, the communist government in Hungary seemed as though they were going to concede to some of the demands of the citizens. They promised that they would allow free elections and that they would withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. But pretty quickly they changed their mind, perhaps because that would mean losing power. And so then they started really lashing out even more strongly against the rebels, and they called for assistance from the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet army came in to help suppress this revolution. Soviet tanks were rumbling down Hungarian streets. Now, remember the context of this. This is the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union are each trying to convince all the other countries you need to be on our side against the other guy, right? You need to not give in to communism or from the other side to capitalism. So it really seemed at least possible to a lot of the Hungarian revolutionaries that once they took action and started trying to overthrow their communist government, that the United States would step in with its military to protect them and help them to maintain the freedom that they were fighting for. And a lot of other people around the world following this kind of had that expectation. However, bear in mind the context, the Cold War. Why was it a Cold War? Because now they have nuclear weapons. A hot war becomes an end of the world war. So Eisenhower was in a really bad position, really. I mean, there was absolutely nothing that he could do directly, militarily, to help those revolutionaries because that would have escalated potentially into a nuclear war. So that was a resounding defeat for efforts to overcome communism in this particular country. It also led to a lot of people, though, who perhaps were leaning toward the left in non-communist countries to sort of take another step back and say, you know, this is horribly repressive. They were trying to have a free election. This is dictatorial still. And so it helped the image, or it hurt the image of both sides, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Another black eye for the United States came in 1960 when a U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace, which, by the way, you're not supposed to be having planes over the other guy's airspace. That's why they call it a spy plane. Also, I'm sure you're aware that both sides did stuff like this. However, for it to be effective, they had to have plausible deniability, right? And that's exactly what Eisenhower did initially. The Soviets said we shot down a spy plane, an American spy plane, over our airspace, and Eisenhower basically said no such thing. We don't even have any spy planes. And the Soviets then announced, "Oh yeah, we have your pilot. We captured him alive." And so that was kind of an oops moment right there. So Eisenhower, to his credit, came on national television and apologized to the American people for having denied all this stuff initially. Explaining that that's essentially what they felt that they had to do, but still taking responsibility for what was really a big scandal. By the way, after spending a year and a half in a Moscow prison, Powers was released in 1962 as part of a prisoner exchange, and so he got to come back home. And yes, this incident is where these guys got their name. And it was during this time, first couple of years of Eisenhower's first, and it was around this time, first couple of years of Eisenhower's first term, that the State Department, under John Foster Dulles, was involved in directing the CIA to launch those coups to overthrow democratically elected leaders in other countries because they seem to be too far to the left. And these are a couple of the ones that we talked about earlier when we discussed hegemony, Guzman and Mossadegh in Guatemala and Iran. It was by no means coincidental that at around this time, the post World War II era, the United States had replaced Great Britain as the dominator of the oil trade and essentially now the dominator of the Middle East, which is a lot of what was going on there in Iran. Mossadegh had been elected and had promised to nationalize the oil industry, making it something totally controlled by Iranians instead of foreign investors. So you see the cartoon here. Here's a couple of guys. One of them has an attaché case that says U.S. diplomacy. The other one has a paper that says Palestine issue. And they're saying we must protect the sacred lands. And of course, they're pointing at the oil derricks. Now, remember that Truman had articulated his own doctrine, the Truman Doctrine, which was that the United States was going to step in to prevent the spread of communism anywhere in the world. Eisenhower went a step further. In the Eisenhower Doctrine, it was announced that the U.S. will aid any Middle Eastern country specifically that was threatened by communism or by Arab nationalism. Remember, in that discussion about hegemony, turns out it is nationalism that gums up the works for the hegemonic power. And that was the warning that had been given by Walter Lippmann in his book Cold War, that this Manichaean view of communism versus capitalism is short-sighted because you got to be watching out for the nationalism. So the Eisenhower Doctrine basically acknowledged both of those things as issues. But remember, the warning was that nationalism, much more than communism, is the threat to hegemony. So remember that as we begin to discuss French Indochina, alias Vietnam.